Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. And I'm so glad to have back on the podcast Jeremy Zug. And Jeremy and I reconnected this past year, and Jeremy is a good friend, and he is one of my go to experts on insurance. But, Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. It's great to be here again, and it's good to talk. How are you
Yes.
doing?
I'm doing okay, doing okay.
Great.
So as I start with everyone, so the folks that might not know you, tell folks a little bit about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started my career in community mental health in 2009, and this will date me a little bit, but I was 14 responding to an ad for a job at our local community mental health center, making paper charts and doing low-level admin work. Did that all through high school, then went to college, met my wife, did billing for a group practice in Chicago, downtown Chicago. And then by the time we moved out of Chicago to come to Michigan, my colleagues from the community mental health days reached out and they said, "Hey, we're doing claims on the floor of our office with a pen and paper. Can you help us do billing?" And that was the genesis of Practice Solutions. And that's how we got started. So Catherine and I have been doing that for the last 8 years, helping independent private practices we do the billing for them, but also we do a lot of education around how to do best practices around insurance billing. It's a really complicated issue. It's a really complicated workflow, and we're happy to be here to help in any way that we can.
Awesome. Yeah. And, I had Jeremy come and did a presentation for my mastermind group, the Practice of Therapy Collaborative. And it was a really fascinating session and just talking about some of the changes with insurance and billing and all of that kind of thing. But, one of the things maybe, Jeremy, that we can maybe start with is just I know there's always there's always been a little bit, at least in my mind, a little bit of a bias to not do insurance in your practice just because quite frankly, it's easier accounting wise and that sort of thing. But the downside of not taking insurance is that you have to work much harder to get clients and that
Mm.
sort of thing. But in your experience, what would be the advantages to accepting insurance in your practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way that we think about this and the way that we've seen hundreds and hundreds of practices run things is that they look at two factors when deciding to take insurance. And I'd be curious about your practice too, Gordon, but I'd
Hmm.
love to ask you about that. But one is the practice financially viable, right? Are you able to work with a private pay load and an insurance load that's able to drive the economic engine of the practice? And then the second thing that private practice owners ask a lot is, am I meeting clinical objectives? Am I working with populations that I love working with? And those two don't have to be mutually exclusive. And so what we see the most often is there's private pay clients and then there's the insurance side of the practice. But we're starting to see the resurgence almost of private pay practices starting separate entities that are insurance based so that they can cover the whole array of patients that they could see. And so we're seeing a big push that way for accessible mental health care. And so that's been really fun to watch and to be involved with.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think as much as anything, you really have to look at your demographics of where you're located.
Mm.
I know for me and people have heard this where I'm located here in East Tennessee. We're a small metropolitan area, the Tri-Cities area, and but we're surrounded by a large rural area that actually covers three states. I mean, we're up where Kentucky, Virginia, and
Mhm.
North Carolina, actually four states if you count them
Yeah.
all, where we all kind of come together up there. And so we draw clients from all four of those states. and just the economics of the area, with it being a lower socioeconomic area, people are dependent on their insurance to pay for
Mhm.
health care and their counseling services and that sort of thing. And I know when I first started private practice, that was a decision I kind of had a lot of consternation on, because
Mm.
I knew it would be easier to
Mhm.
do private pay. I mean, it's just, take the money, and then filing insurance claims is a whole different other thing. But it does, and you can speak to this, Jeremy, you can have a very profitable practice accepting insurance.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that's really important there with what you just said. So your practice draws on all these different states, right? People coming in, and one of the pieces of the puzzle for insurance reimbursement that's starting to come to light, that billers have known for a while, is each state has huge variability in terms of reimbursement rate, right?
Hmm.
Tennessee's reimbursement rate, very different from Florida's, very different from West Virginia's, and all of those are wildly different from the Western states, right?
Hmm.
And so you look at those, and I think that's where some of the confusion and maybe the conflict comes from across the country, now that all these private practices can talk across state lines and Facebook groups, and like your mastermind group, for example, or the event that you and I connected at. And you talk about taking insurance with a private practice in Florida versus a private practice in Wyoming, and they're going to have very different financial realities of running their practice with insurance. So
Hmm.
I think that's an important piece of this too, that if you're in a
Hmm.
state that your reimbursement rates are really, really bad, that's a consideration for sure.
Right.
And then you pile on top of that, if you have a payer or an insurance company who's onerous to deal with, it makes it almost impossible to want to do that. So, Gordon, how did you decide which insurance companies to get in network with? Since you felt like that was something you had to work in, how did
Yeah.
you make that decision?
Well, yeah. So initially, I made some bad decisions, and
Okay.
yeah. But I would say look at your top in your area, which insurance company do the majority of people use, or
Mm-hmm.
their employers use, because usually it's employer driven as far as what
Mm-hmm.
sort of health plan a person has. And I would start with those to begin with. And I think too, I don't think you need to get credentialed with everyone and everything.
Agreed.
And
Yeah,
and that's
for
what
sure.
and that was the mistake I made, is I tried to
Mm-hmm.
just, okay, I'm going to try to be credentialed with everything that is walking and breathing out there, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's been smart of us to just actually fire some insurance companies,
Mm-hmm.
you know, get off their panels, just because one, they were hard to deal with, or
For sure.
two, just the reimbursement rates just were not fair or in line with what we needed. So,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, so yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, that's kind of yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, you bring up a good point. And just as we're recording this week that we're recording this, Medicare Advantage announced that they had a 5% reimbursement rate increase, which is, you look at that and you go, wow, that's a pretty significant increase for Medicare Advantage. But I think you have to be really careful when you see that kind of news, right? You have to balance that kind of news against why they're able to give an increase, right? Which is that there's been something of an exodus out of Medicare Advantage because it's been very, very difficult to work with. And so the reason why Medicare Advantage plans can offer an increase is not because it's not a benevolent government funding issue. We have more capital because we have fewer providers in the network as a result of all of them leaving. And
Hmm.
so, or all of the ones that have left, not all of them leaving. And so, you get a raise in that sense, but you also don't get a raise because of the work it takes to work with the insurance company. And there's a map I'll send to you, Gordon, after this, but it shows the biggest payer in every state. And I think a lot of private practice owners would be surprised to learn that Blue Cross Blue Shield does not have a corner on the market countrywide. I mean, there are a whole bunch of insurance companies that dominate in their respective states.
Mm-hmm.
And I think reimbursement and size of the insurance company matter, but how difficult are they to work with really, right? And I think that's where
Mm-hmm.
you get to, we need to fire a few of these. So
Yeah.
yeah, how is
Mm-hmm.
that talking to patients about firing an insurance plan and
Yeah.
handling
Well,
that?
it's, fortunately, there's people like you that kind of help us with kind of making those decisions.
Hmm.
And so I think as much as anything, doing your due diligence, and you can, again, you can speak to this
Hmm.
on
Yeah.
the front end when you're doing the intake with people and making sure that you're doing a good job explaining to them about number one, how insurance works, and
Hmm.
things like meeting deductibles and the difference between a copay versus co-insurance and all of those kinds of things. And then those insurance companies that require pre-approval, but I'm guessing that there's a lot of those that it's less so now needing pre-approval for mental health care, particularly outpatient mental health care, than it used to be. Is
That's
that
right.
what you're finding as well? I mean, it's
Yeah,
pretty.
pre-approval for insurance or for mental health services in an outpatient office setting has largely been a thing of the past ever since the Parity Act has been revised and revised. And I think the last administration did a good job of trying to limit the amount of shenanigans that insurance companies can use to limit mental health care. So one of the technical terms you'll hear thrown around a lot, but has very little education around, is something called a non-quantitative treatment limitation. So, for example, right, if you are in network with, let's just throw out a name like Centene, for example, or Optum or United, and let's say that you go 20 sessions and then all of a sudden the reimbursement stops coming in and you start getting letters about, is this medically necessary? That's an example of a non-quantitative treatment limitation that is technically not legal with the legislation that has been put forward
Mm-hmm.
and enacted by our government. And so that's a good example of the kind of shenanigans that push mental health providers out of networks for sure. And I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of education to be had around how insurance works for clients. But when you start to look at things like denial rate, right? In Michigan, there's a certain payer, I won't mention their name, but they deny 35% of their claims. And you look at that and you go, well, all right, that's more than one out of every three claims I'm going to send. And then it's going to cost my practice. This is actually the number. It's $25 to $30 in practice expense to rework a denial.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if I'm going to spend $30 out of every three claims I send, why would I be in network with you? And
Mm-hmm.
that's a really important consideration, right?
Right.
And you can look at all the other shenanigans that you have to go through. But have you run into a lot of that in your practice? Just like letters,
We're
we're not paying
starting.
for this.
Well, yeah, we're starting to run into more of that.
Hmm.
And I know that was something you spoke to with our mastermind group, was just, how do you handle chargebacks? That's one of the things that we've run into, as well as particularly if somebody has like co-insurance, or not co-insurance, but secondary insurance.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, so like, and that's really, you see that a lot with maybe people who have both Medicare and Medicaid. We see that a lot where, you know, one one won't pay until the other one denies it, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
that's right.
Right,
Yeah,
right. And
yeah,
so then there's the standoff between the two insurance companies about who's going to pay this claim,
yeah, that's
and
right.
and that sort of thing. So what strategies would you say people should use in cases like that?
Okay, so chargebacks have really made a comeback, right? If we can maybe be a
Mhm.
little tongue in cheeky, but chargebacks are a useful mechanism for clients in some cases, right? And I think this is important to frame out, because chargebacks is not just like a across the board evil. There are times that you have a client who does have a secondary insurance company that should be primary, right? And there's been a mistake somewhere at the patient registration level.
Mhm.
So if you get a chargeback, one of the first actions to take is to go to your client and say, clarify for me again which insurance is primary and which one is secondary. Because it very well could be that they have their insurance mixed up, right? Let's say you have a minor and each parent, the minor is on both insurance plans, right? And they get those mixed up and we'll just throw yours as the primary and yours as the secondary. And then you bill those and it's wrong and there's a chargeback, right? So in some sense, that can be a helpful mechanism. Where you get into a lot of shenanigans is like what you're talking about. So, a couple of strategies I would recommend. One, just make sure that your patient education is clear in your registration process, that you are double checking the eligibility and benefits of anybody with more than one insurance plan, right? And there are people with 3 insurance plans. I know it sounds
Mhm.
outrageous, but that does happen. And so
Mhm.
making sure you have the order correct in terms of who you're going to submit a claim to first is very important. And then the second thing is to commit a certain amount of time, leave some amount of margin in your week, whether it's your administrative team or you, whoever's doing the billing, leave some margin in your week to be able to fight this stuff, right? We know, and the insurance companies know this too, but only 1% of all denials ever get appealed, which means that companies like Evicor, I don't mind calling them out because I think it's total shenanigans, but when you look at companies that wholesale deny claims because they know that you won't be able to chase all the denials and you'll only appeal 1%, you start to think through the math of that a little bit, right?
Mhm.
And so leaving space in your schedule to do that. It's unfortunate, but it is one of the things that you have to plan for, I think. So
Mhm.
yeah, how have you navigated the time requirement to rework some of those things, Gordon?
Yeah, so this is like I see what you're doing there because this brings us back around to practice solutions. So one of the
Perhaps, yeah.
things that yeah, one of the things, Jeremy, I think is that you have to really look at your time. I'm in my practice, we do have an intake coordinator, and she handles all the intakes and making sure that we've got everything for the insurance and all those things that you're talking about. And but if you're in a practice, and particularly practice owners, if you're spending a lot of time chasing claims, your
Hmm.
time is going to be much better spent outsourcing that to, like Practice Solutions and
Hmm.
people like Jeremy, that that's all they do because they know it better, and you don't have to chase it all down like that. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, so it might, yeah, I think that's, I know, knowing Jeremy and what the Practice Solutions does, how is, people think about, okay, well, that's more money I'm going to have to pay out. But when you look at the return on the investment of that, the math works.
It depends on how the practice owner is going to use that time, though, right? So, and I
Mhm.
want to talk a little bit about that because
Mhm.
outsourcing is a lever that the practice owner has that they can pull if it makes sense, right? So
Mhm.
we deal with practice owners, like we build out billing departments for organizations too, right? So if
Mhm.
at a certain size, it makes a lot of sense to go in-house, right? You have a full-time person, you can train them, develop your internal SOPs, and you can really run a billing department at a certain size of private practice for way cheaper than you can outsource it. But
Mhm.
that's an economic reality of running a
Mhm.
private practice. And as you grow, right, you want to do that.
Mhm.
And we see it as a raging success when a practice that we've been working with for a long time gets to that point because we know they're going to be able to carry out their mission much better with an internal
Mhm.
person full time.
Mhm.
Where you get into trouble is, and I was just talking to a lovely practice owner this week who, busy practice owner, has a caseload, has clinicians, and is doing the billing. I think that's when you start to say, okay, well, does outsourcing start to make sense? Because you look at 5 sessions, let's say 5 sessions a week, right, is what you're spending on billing. Those 5 sessions are way more valuable than an outsourced vendor. And also you can save yourself some stress as well, right? There's an
Mhm.
intangible there. So It depends on where you are in your practice growth journey, right? And it
Yeah.
makes sense to DIY, and then it makes sense to outsource, and then it makes sense to insource in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
So that's usually the kind
Yeah.
of the growth path that we see and you want
Right.
to see out of a private practice.
What, in your experience, Jeremy, what size practice would really want to start looking at maybe hiring an in-house billing person?
You want to start looking and you want to start thinking about this process as you approach around $800,000 in annual revenue, just top
Yeah.
line gross revenue. And the reason you want to start there is if you've gotten to that point, one, congratulations, that's amazing. And
Hmm.
two, you have everything worked out from a systems perspective. Like you're able to grow this thing
Hmm.
in a substantial way. And what we see from our metrics is that without any additional effort put in on the part of the practice owner, you'll see 11% year over year growth on a well-established practice, right? This is a practice that has good clinicians, low attrition, good marketing. They've gotten everything figured out, right? And so we've been able to track their growth because we get to see it. And it's like 11% year over year is usually what you can come to expect. But at 800,000 or 750, you start to say in the next 6 months, we're going to need somebody. And that's usually how long it takes to build out a billing department, right? Because you
Hmm.
need to take in a bunch of new workflow that you're not used to. And that's going to take some runway, right? If you
Hmm.
show up if one day you wake up and your practice is big and you flip over your profit and loss statement right now during tax season, right? And you're
Hmm.
like, oh man, this is a huge budget line. It's a little too late if you want to cut that out, right? Now,
Right.
some practices at that size or bigger, they go, we don't want to deal with the HR burden, which makes sense. They don't want to deal with turnover or whatever. Makes
Hmm.
sense. But most practices, that starts to make sense around that size and scale. Have,
Right.
have you seen something similar from your experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that sounds about right. Yeah. And I think that's, again, kind of my mantra that people have heard from me over and over again over the years is the importance of knowing your numbers and understanding your
Mm.
numbers. As far as I had a consulting call before we got to recording here with a clinician, and one of the things is just understanding, particularly if an insurance based business, just the basics of, like, what is your average reimbursement rate across the board, so
Yeah. That's
not
right.
only our average per session rate, not only from what you get from insurance, but also for any private pay clients you might have, and that sort
Yeah,
of thing.
that's right.
So all of that you gotta, and that figures into, what you're going to pay your people if you're a group practice, and where you're going to put things. So I think you've got to really look at that. But I think you're right. When the gross income of a practice starts approaching that upper end of the six digits,
Yeah, you
might
really
want
got
to
to start
look at.
looking.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, no,
So
and I think the biggest, and I think you have done an amazing job in the marketplace with helping clinicians develop their money mindset in a lot of ways. I think it's been one of the biggest changes we've seen over the last decade of doing this stuff. That when we started, the education and the mentorship around that particular issue, there's an area of, it's not my expertise, this is yours really, but there were a lot more questions and a lot more stress around knowing your numbers and knowing the money, and that has largely gone away. So I think that's a problem that has largely become extinct, I think in large part to what you're doing. So I
mhm.
appreciate that because we used to have a
Yeah.
lot more conversations around that topic that we weren't really qualified, or it's not our
Right.
expertise. So it's been
Yeah.
great to watch that macro
Hmm.
shift. And
Sure.
I really appreciate it for sure.
Yeah, well, good,
So yeah,
good. Yeah. Well, I've got to be aware of our time, Jeremy.
sure.
Tell folks that would maybe want to get in touch with you and work with Practice Solutions, kind of a little bit about your process. And
Hmm.
also, I know we've got some resources for people to check out and a landing page, and we'll talk about that
Yeah.
here in a minute. But if somebody wanted to work with you all, what's kind of your process for that happening?
Yeah, it's a good question because we don't work with everybody that calls us. So we want to make sure that we're a good fit for the practices that call us. If you go to our website, practicesol.com, there will be a contact form there, which will connect you to a human being. Or if you call us, you'll get a human being on the phone. And what we do is we have a list of questions that we will ask you about your practice. And if we think it makes sense and adds value to your life, then that would be somebody that we'd want to work with. But we often recommend a whole host of strategies to the practices that call us, because what we don't want to do is just get a client for client's sake. We don't want to work with a practice just because they're available. That's oftentimes not the right move. The right move is for us to say, what is the best thing in our experience for your practice? So we can do billing for practices, and we do a lot of that. We also, like I said, we conduct practice health checks. So if you needed a discovery audit, let's say you're scratching your head on, I think I should be making more, but I'm not sure where the problem is, but I don't really have the time to look. We can do a 2 to 3 day practice health check where we audit your billing department. That's been really fun. We've really enjoyed that service. And then if you wanted a billing department built out, we're also able to do that. We have a team dedicated for that service as well. So we can run the gamut of what stage of practice you're in, and we'll always advise you on what we've seen work out the best. So if
Right.
if nothing else, you just needed an advisor, we're happy to talk for sure.
All right, right. And tell folks too, you've written a book on insurance billing that covers some of the basics and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So the book is Insurance Billing Basics: Steps for Therapists to Successfully Take Insurance. We get a lot of the same questions around, hey, what is a copay? Or should I credential? This is a really common one, right? Should I credential with every insurance company in my area? And in the book, we give you very practical, very consumable content around how to think through taking insurance. It's really our worldview for how to approach an insurance-based practice from what we've been able to glean over the years of working with private practices across the country and in different stages. And I think it is a really tight, concise worldview around how to think through insurance. And so
Hmm.
that's why we wrote the book, because we found that there's a need there, and we wanted to produce a piece of content that, because billing Gordon it's not a page turner, right? Like there's never going to be like
Hmm. Oh yeah.
like New York Times best-selling billing book, right?
Uh-huh.
But what we wanted to do is take a chip off the block around educating and demystifying this process, especially since we love independent private practices. We want to see more of them. And so if we can shorten the distance between big question marks around insurance and a well-developed strategy and action around insurance, that's really helpful. So that
Yes.
was the
Yes.
idea. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. And so if you'll go to, I'll mention here, we set up a pretty
Yeah.
link. Go to practiceoftherapy.com/practice solutions, and you can find the book there and also more information about working with Jeremy. And we'll have that link here in the show notes and the show summary.
Mhm.
The other thing I know, Jeremy, you're in the process of starting a podcast. And
Yeah, that's
so,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's
So
a
that,
long road, as you know. Any tips, Gordon,
mhm.
for those of us on the
Oh
front
yeah,
end of
oh
this?
yeah. That's a whole conversation in and of itself.
Okay.
But yeah, so yeah, so to be mindful of our time, Jeremy. Any quick
Yeah.
parting thoughts?
Well, one, thank you for all your work, Gordon, in the private practice space, and thank you for the content you put out. So that's one parting thought. The second parting thought is that we need more private practices. What I mean by we is the industry, the country. It's a really turbulent time. There's a lot of volatility, as you know. At the time we're
Mm-hmm.
recording this, it's been a really volatile week, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think we need more therapists that provide accessible care across the country. It's needed. And so don't quit, keep going. And we really appreciate everything that private practices are doing for the country. Yeah,
No, they're very
that's
kind.
great.
Well,
Yeah,
Jeremy, it's so good to have you back on the podcast, and I'm sure folks you're going to be hearing more from Jeremy
yeah,
as
yeah.
we move through this journey. So, but be sure to check
Absolutely.
out the web page, his landing page. You can go to practiceoftherapy.com/practice solutions, or if you want to do it in reverse, you can go to practicesol.com/Gordon, and that'll get you the
Mhm.
same landing page. So either way, I'll get you there. And there'll be links here again. And so, well, Jeremy,
Great.
thanks. And give my best to your wife, Catherine.